We are back for another episode of Beyond Barriers. Beyond Barriers is a conversation with leaders and community evangelists about the challenges of navigating an effective accessibility strategy. In these episodes, guests get to share their successes and setbacks with a primary focus on how they've overcome specific obstacles that otherwise could have disrupted the accessibility journey. My name is Brian Gavin. I'm the co-founder of Wally, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Hector Minto from Microsoft. Hector, thank you so much for joining me.
My absolute pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I want to just say thank you. Your support within the accessibility space and the drive that your energy gives off is pretty powerful. So surely it'll be an interesting conversation today.
Yeah, I can't wait for it. And the more that we as Microsoft can do to support companies who are focused in this space and kind of raise awareness about them, that's part of the game here. So let's go.
Very good. Well, good exposure in the accessibility world. Obviously, doing a lot of evangelism within Microsoft. How did you get into accessibility and the journey so far?
Yeah, sure. So I started back in the 90s, really in the assistive technology space. And I'm always trying to help people see the difference between assistive technology, the tools that people use and rely on a daily basis, and then accessibility, the structural deliverable of the infrastructure around us being accessible. But I fell into it in the 90s, actually working with the first page turners, essentially helping people with physical disabilities turn their pages on newspapers. And Brian, I'd love to show you some pictures of it at some point. But think of it as a big vacuum pump, and then a car aerial swinging the physical pages of newspapers around. I was essentially driving around and meeting people who'd had spinal cord injuries, who had ALS, helping them to read, which I always think of as my first entree into accessibility. That's people accessing the news, and of course the modern equivalent now is like what you're doing, helping us all access the digital world around us. So I fell into it at first, and then essentially a career of kind of just larger companies, bigger impact. Joined Microsoft 7 years ago because you could really see this moment where tech companies at the largest scale are starting to say, well, this is on us, and companies like Microsoft have been doing this for some time, but that reliance of people with disabilities on digital tech nowadays has never been greater. It's not going to go away. So it just felt like the perfect time for me to join. But essentially think of my background as being really an assistive technologist, working with companies and firms building and designing and inventing assistive technology. And I've come into the accessibility space.
Interesting. I would have you gone back and studied the page flipper sense to kind of keep the brain thinking about the simplicity of what needs to happen on the digital side?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I always say to people, the thing about the page turner was just that, like, that's the platform. So, we think about operating systems now, but the idea of just the vacuum pump in the car aerial, well, that was the operating system. The input method was the switch. And so you would meet somebody who would blow through a straw, and you would meet somebody who would blink an eye, or somebody who would tap a head switch. My job as an assistive technologist was not to work out whether the operating system worked. Newspapers are pretty consistent in the way that they're designed, right? Books are
Right.
relatively consistent. The trick was getting the input method right for somebody, and then you were guaranteed their access. So that was really where my focus was, and that still stands today. If somebody needs to access any kind of device, access their PC, and they're a Switch user, they still need to work out what the switch is. Yeah. So like some things have not changed a single bit, but
Yeah.
the method, the delivery method, of course, has changed massively.
I love the connection that you just tied from, the operating system to the input and the output, right? And in many ways, the digital landscape is like you're saying, you have your preferred browser
Yep.
that you're accessing the digital content. You have the ability for these sites and applications to interact with the solutions that these operating systems and browsers are providing, and then you have the experience that the user of the digital content, the reader of that newspaper, gets.
Yeah, that's right. And the one thing that the newspaper industry decided amongst them was some level of consistency, right? There was a level of consistency in terms of size and delivery. So it was easy for us to design solutions around that. When we think about digital experiences delivered through the devices that we're all sat in front of now, we don't have quite the level of consistency that we're after in terms of the delivery method, right? And so that's one of our biggest challenges.
Yeah, I mean, you have different browsers provided by different companies that affects how the digital content is rendered.
Yeah.
Um, and from brands that I talk to, there's it's becoming very transparent to me that there's such a huge gap in the analytics that these companies can consume about the input and the output
Hmm.
experience that the users have, right? There's been a lot of I would say user journey solutions created to measure, you know, or look at what people are actually doing on a site. But when it
Hmm.
comes down to the assistive technologies, that's I don't know. We're probably talking about a business opportunity here, but
Well,
so many
actually,
companies. Fine, go ahead.
yeah, so somebody started looking at that, and was there a way that we could actually understand whether somebody's using third-party assistive technology in their browser experience? And actually, there was quite a bit of pushback from the disability community to say, well, hang on, that's my business, like how I'm operating my technology. And so
Yeah,
it's a super interesting space. I think what we're going to see over time is that more people are going to start to say, like what's the global benefit of people knowing how people are using their devices, and there's a way to anonymize that information. So yeah,
yeah,
but it's still a desirable, of course.
yeah. I mean, a clean room, if you will, of scrubbing the data so that it's anonymized. But I think that would be so huge. And then I want to go back to just one thing. You mentioned the differences between the assistive technology focus that you've had, and then the infrastructure um, support that's needed to make this happen. Right. The two are very connected. Right. So are you working cross functionally with these teams, or how do the two play together? Or and especially, I guess, in some ways, they're two different total entities, right?
Let me
You have the
let me
operating system. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me make an admission. I wonder whether I've ever said this on camera before. Okay, but let's go.
First
um,
for everything.
but, but look, I was obsessed with assistive technology, the input method. Um, but in all of the years I was working with assistive technology, hardly anyone ever spoke to me about creating accessible content because I was so obsessed with things like home control, people's speech devices. The whole delivery of assistive technology around the world is very health and medical model motivated. So it's like how do you access your home and your independent living, or how do you access your voice? You see so many stories of people with physical disabilities and speech disabilities accessing their computer, but the mantra, the reason is in order to communicate. But when we look at government provision of computer access around the world and support of the computer access piece, it's poor. I mean, there's no other way of describing it. It's poor. And it wasn't until I joined Microsoft, I promise you, I really got into accessibility and like creating accessible content. And I genuinely felt a bit of a fraud at first. I thought, wow, I've got this great job in this amazing company. And, obviously we play our bit in the tools, the assistive technology, the magnifiers, the screen readers, the access methods, and all this kind of stuff. Suddenly I found when I was out there talking to my peers and my teams, I was like, I don't know enough about how to test for accessibility. No one's really spoken to me about creating accessible documents in the past because I just didn't live in that world. And so I made incredible mistakes when I joined Microsoft. But what's been interesting is I think what I've been able to do is help also the other way round. So what I see is there's accessibility, assistive technologists don't know enough about accessibility, and accessibility pros do not keep up to date on what's happening in the assistive tech space. And how they can, and to design well, my goodness, you've got to have good understanding. And then I'm going to break it down even more. People who are really focused on the blind experience are not keeping up to speed on the deaf experience, yeah, and not designing around that, or the cognitive experience. And so unfortunately we continue to work in silos. It's
Mm,
like, what's the job I've got, not what's the solution I'm trying to build, and what's the ecosystem that I exist in. The more I've engaged with, I mean, it's a real privilege, some of the conversations I've had in the last 7 years, but the more I kind of get to meet teams who are doing so much of this great work around us, that's the common theme, is that we're over indexing on probably one of those two buckets. And so please don't, when people hear me talking, and I'm 27 years down the track here, I still don't know everything, and I still don't code, and that's not my wheelhouse. But I do think there's a clear call to action to all of you kind of working in the accessibility space to stay connected to, I would even say, the supply chain of assistive tech in your local market, because those people that you'll meet working for those great AT companies are the ones that are, really focused on kind of the user experience, and and in this AI world, the new user experiences. I mean, hopefully we come on to that a bit later.
Yeah.
But I do think there's a duty to kind of make sure we're ticking both boxes.
Well, I would be curious, has there have maybe it was a first admission that you've made of what you just shared, but I've heard a lot of folks talk about, day one accessibility exposure and from a schooling and educational aspect, and being very focused on accessibility. And then you are a little bit more on the experiential side
Yep.
of the assistive technologies that probably had a lot more application to those within the accessibility community and even far outside of that, right? Because of, voice interaction and other things.
Yep.
Was there like, oh, where would you start? Is there a better way to start, or?
It may sound corny, but I genuinely think it's true, is start with the person and the holistic experience of the person. So in a lot of the training that
Yeah.
I'm doing with Microsoft, I'm training thousands of people on like built-in assistive technologies and accessibility within Microsoft products. We've just come off a
Yeah.
project where we trained 27,000 work coaches here in the UK, people who are helping people with disabilities into work. We've literally just been training them on basic assistive technology. But no matter how many magnifiers or screen readers or alternative access methods, adaptive mice, keyboards, etc., that we will talk to people about, the one thing we always end up with is, let's pivot to creating an accessible experience. We all have to know how to build an accessible email or an accessible social media post or an accessible newsletter. And if all of us start with, hey, we're really focused on the tools that people use, let's just do one more thing on building an accessible experience. To me, that's the inflection point. It's when people go,
Mhm.
hang on, this isn't just me about me, and I'm saying inverted commas, solving the access method for somebody. It's also about me working with their team to create accessible experiences. You need both. So it's to me, I'm always going to start with the person, and it starts with what's the person's entry into the technology. So I'm always focused on the switch. Like I said for the page turner, it's at what point do we then pivot to say, okay, we've got the access method sorted now. Now who's creating the content? When I used to work with AAC users, speech devices, I was creating accessible content because once I'd sorted out that somebody was going to use their eye gaze, their eyes to control their communication aid, we then had to have conversations about how many buttons can we press? Yeah, what's the visual ability of somebody? Are we going to use some extra magnification in that experience? So I was doing it in terms of the design experience, but I wasn't in the formal piece of what's alt text. Like, I didn't know about alt text until I joined Microsoft. That's really the admission.
Well, I think you said the supply chain, right, of the organization, and all of the inputs. I've kind of spoken to it as the content supply of the organization.
Mm,
All of the teams that go into the output have a contribution and a responsibility to the
absolutely,
accessibility piece.
absolutely,
And
yeah.
so we were talking as we were getting up and running, the challenges of trying to look at it from the top level
Mm,
supply chain level, when you go to scale and really manage an effective strategy. You have a very good vantage point on some of those
mm.
challenges across content supply.
Yeah, so look, and that's really what my project's been about for the last 5, 6 years. We started off with,
Hmm.
like a tech evangelist for accessibility with Microsoft was really just I would almost say like a cheerleader, right? Honestly, I mean, that's really what it was. It was like, come on, let's just go and get everyone going and kick off the conversation. And we get so many speaker requests, frankly, Brian. People want us to go to events and talk about what we're doing,
Hmm.
what are the new features, what are the new tools, what's our approach. So there's a lot of demand on Microsoft, but I very quickly worked out that, like, in order for us to really make a difference, we've got to go to the customer, as in proactively go to Microsoft customers. This is not a let's hope Microsoft rock up at the event and talk about this topic and everyone feels good for an hour and then just goes back to the way they always did things. This is, how do I help my account teams who are focused on biggest brands, biggest customers in the world build coherent accessibility strategies that start with colleague experiences, how are we helping the employees within an organization, but then working through to the skills and the capabilities across the whole organization to, as you say, procure, build, test, and deliver accessible technology, because every company is a software company. That's the famous Satya Nadella quote. It's like, right, we're all software companies now. Well, are we all accessible software companies? Nah, we're nowhere near. I mean, we're frankly nowhere near. Yeah. But
Yeah.
until we start helping the C-suite have this conversation, to me, and building kind of, coherent accessibility strategies that really go all the way through from their people through to their tech. Yeah. That to me now is the new challenge. And that's, I didn't come into the job thinking that was the challenge. I thought it was just an awareness piece, was going to really help drive awareness. And that's still a big part of it. This is much more strategic than that now. This is much more about saying, how do we do it and plan for it with our customers? How do we support the tech sector? And how do we lift the work of assistive technology and accessibility professionals up in terms of the awareness, even within their own organizations? I'll still meet amazing accessibility teams in some of the biggest companies, household names that and their CIO and CTO don't know they exist. They're like they're a project. They're not strategic. And I think
Yeah.
one of the things we need to be doing, and like I would say across big tech, this is not unique to Microsoft, right? But when we are the platform providers for so many of the businesses around the world, I think it's incumbent upon us to really help lift the work of yourselves, and AT professionals, accessibility professionals around the world, to really kind of become seen to be much more strategic. Linking colleague experiences to tech deliverable, to me, is the secret sauce.
The aspect, I mean, yeah, there's a huge responsibility that Microsoft has. It's almost like dog food your own gospel or your own principles, right?
Yeah.
I hear the same thing talking to brands where the CIO or the CTO, it's almost like such a microcosm of a budget line item in some
Mm.
ways, because
Yeah.
like, oh, well, in our case, we provide technology, and it's like, well, how much are you actually allocating to accessibility, your accessibility strategy overall? There's no way to even quantify it at
Mm.
these big
Mm.
brands. Is there like an aha moment that you've provided to the executive level members of an organization to say, like, this is a strategic?
I, I obviously can't name names, okay, but let
Yeah.
me just say there's always a starting point for the conversation, right? So let's maybe just cover a few of them, okay, and sort of show the pivot, okay. But
Yeah.
quite often there's a moment that Microsoft's having with customers. So at the moment we're all moving to Copilot, right? Or a few years ago we were all moving to Teams. Okay, so there's a lot of drive from our sales teams around the world in terms of like that journey. But the moment you're asking a large organization to start moving to a new tool at scale, the accessibility flag gets waved. Yeah. Or the disability community flag gets waved if they've got a good disability community. Somebody somewhere says, "Oh, hang on, is Teams accessible?" Yeah. Or hang on, how are we onboarding people who are used to using their AT with one tool, and now we're asking everyone to go over that? So I remember some of my very first experiences. That was my bread and butter, was like these conversations, like risk management, I would say, from a colleague experience. Okay.
Mm.
So what we then do is we jump in and we work with our partners. We have some amazing partners around the world doing this adoption work, but adding accessibility to their adoption work. And the trick then is to go, okay, you now know disabled people work here, yeah, and you now know, because we've done maybe a bit of a program of work on that, far more than you probably thought. Okay, so what I'm saying is we
Mm.
take the challenge of, oh, we've got the community. By the time Microsoft's been through the party, or our partners, what we've generally done is educate people on a much wider array of kind of benefits of the tools that we're providing. And suddenly the CIO and HR are kind of sitting there going, okay, this is great. IT is kind of going, great, we're giving people the tools they need, and HR is going, great. I'm like, we're building an inclusive culture, and people are happy. The point then is, how do you take that awareness of your own representation into what are we building in this organization? And when we talk about building in an organization, we're talking SharePoint sites, we're talking internal websites, we're talking payroll, we're talking internal learning. It's at that point that we have the opportunity to extend this awareness of disability into what the heck are we building? And are we being deliberate about, and I'm not saying are we being accessible, just are we being deliberate? Or do we even have a policy? Do we have a policy about newsletters in this organization should be accessible? These are simple, easy mandates that a CTO can essentially put out into an organization, or a CHRO, an HR team can work with their
Yeah.
CTO on. And what that does is that drives a demand. It says, well, hang on, well, we don't know how to do this. Okay. Hence you enter stage right, Brian, any you folks out there kind of come, great, let's work with people to show them how to do this and build this. Okay. So that's one, is not enough of that is happening. Like, there's amazing D&I work around disability right now, but nobody's consistently saying, okay, let's move to that next horizon. Let's get into it. So that's one thing. The other thing we get is customer risk. So customer risk, I mean, you know about this. Website accessibility feels like a risky conversation to many organizations, and it's risk driven, the conversation quite often. And so organizations will look at their own accessibility because of risk. But what they're not doing at that point then is kind of going, well, hang on, we've established that our customers want this. How do we then start bringing it back the other way? So they kind of they spin up a project team to go and build the accessible website, but then they miss the opportunity to kind of go, well, hang on, or they do a great bit of innovation. We did an amazing bit of innovation with one company. Again, I won't name, but essentially, when we went in to do the internal launch of that amazing customer-focused tool on accessibility, I met their internal employee group, and they were like, "This doesn't feel great." Because we're saying all this public stuff about how accessible we are, but I can't even get a reasonable accommodation in the workplace. See what I'm saying? So there's just this, it's the silos we talked about at the start. But
Yeah.
I think it's that opportunity to just, like, don't just do the project you're on. Look left and right. Look left towards customer to colleague, and if you're just working on colleague stuff, look right towards product and brand and skills.
Would you say that the disconnect between the left and the right, the colleague and the consumer, is because the brand or the company hasn't prioritized it as a strategic executive company level initiative?
Yeah, so yeah, or it's too
Well,
low
I don't
down.
know.
Or it's even just too low down. So even if you look at the colleague experience, not every CHRO understands about accommodation processes. Why would they? These are large organizations sometimes. So there's a team doing
Yeah.
that kind of work, but it's not strategic. When we raise it up to a C-suite conversation, and this is exactly what we do at Microsoft, I'll happily share that with you. Like we report to all of the leaders at Microsoft, like how their part of the business is doing, because every single bit of a business has something to do with disability and accessibility, whether it's marketing, legal, whether it's product design, whether it's dev, whether it's HR. So essentially, we send one report to all of the senior leaders at Microsoft, and it's discussed once a quarter. So, when you start lifting the conversation, and sometimes what it is just an internal report from HR and IT on the work they've done on disability in front of the C-suite to then say, right, the next bit we need is the CTO to step in. The CTO goes, great, I'm all in, because they're standing in front of their CEO at that point going, hang on, how do you say no to accessibility? and they shouldn't say no to accessibility, let's be clear. But there is internal selling that needs to be done on this topic. I mean, it'd be crazy to pretend otherwise. Most organizations are trying to find their justification. What I will say is, once people understand how one part of the business impacts the success of the other part of the business, that's when you start to get the stickiness. And then you start to see kind of some planning and communicating between leaders on the topic. And when you get leaders, what do you unlock? You unlock budget. I mean, come on. Like, everyone knows this. Yeah, so unlocking budget is probably one of the biggest challenges in the accessibility space. It's always seen as a bit of an afterthought. And it's not just an afterthought in terms of design. It's quite often an afterthought in terms of just paying, and so this is key.
It's, very, very valid feedback on how to go about driving the adoption. I think what I internalize is like this effort of the CTO and the chief human resource officer and otherwise having to report on these metrics. That's the basic accountability of any other strategic initiative. That's how these are supposed to be, right? And so it's not really about developing a new way of reporting on it or conversing on it. It needs to be folded into a strategic initiative period. And from there, just hold your teams accountable, because yeah, I mean, large household brands that I talk to, so we had several of them join a conversation, right? And it was one of the questions that we asked was like, well, who's an expert in accessibility? And naturally, like the folks that we had invited, they're all kind of experts. So everyone raised their hand. And we asked the question about, are they aware about, if you're in program management, what's happening in development and tech? Or if you're
Uh-huh.
in tech, are you aware about what's happening in the learning and development team? Nope. It was just not there.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of synergy lost because training and development was focused on very similar type output and um, contribution that development was, but no one was able to take advantage, and so there's such a loss of efficiency there too. That's
Yeah,
the other aspect.
it's interesting. Obviously, we're a tech firm, right? But
Yeah,
we're a global tech firm. But every single Microsoft employee is trained on accessibility now. Every single one, and that
yeah.
includes lawyers, that includes marketers, it includes developers, it includes salespeople. And essentially, you learn three things. You learn what is disability, the people side of things. What tools do people need to be successful? How do people use their technology? We're a tech company. Uh,
Hmm.
so that ticks all those boxes in
Natural.
terms of like, hey, I'm interested. We're techies, okay. And then how do you build an accessible experience? Now, how do you build an accessible experience is, well, if you're in events, here's an events guide. Yeah. If you're in internal comms, here's a documents guide. If you're in software development, here's some testing tools that we recommend, and here is the Microsoft accessibility standard that you have to build your products to. Don't let us down. Yeah. Yeah. So it's
No
like,
pressure.
and that's strategic. It's deliberate, but
Yeah.
we did not train everybody from the start. To convince a company of 200,000 people that essentially we're going to train everybody and everyone's going to take that hour to learn accessibility, that's a cost. That's a cost. That's that's time not doing other stuff, and all that kind of stuff. So you've got to justify it. There's got to be ROI on it. But we genuinely had got to like over 50% had taken it voluntarily just through our internal culture and drive of the topic and awareness, things like the Ability Summit. And then it was much easier to convince the learning development team, come on, let's do that. And it's what's
Well,
still one of the
FOMO.
but it's still one of the biggest demands we get when we engage with our customers is, well, how did you do it? I always say to them, well, we didn't just switch it on. You got to build some momentum first before you can kind of get to that point.
Interesting. So the perspective on how to be cohesive from a strategic point of view is amazing. There's still a lot of opportunity for growth. What are going to be the biggest disruptions? You had said new AI coming, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah. I mean, that's
I'm not going to
definitely.
let you just new AI, but yeah, what are the bigger disruptors that are going to come to accessibility either on, it doesn't have to be technology. It could be something as simple as better executive plan.
Yeah. I've got two things. I mean, so just before we get to the tech, and the tech is exciting, of course.
Sure.
I think it's the mainstreaming of the topic. Okay, so you mentioned procurement. Okay, and so when we think about people buying technology solutions and being more demanding of accessibility, there's a genuine heightening of awareness. And so hopefully over time, we're
Mm-hmm.
going to, and I speak to huge companies who are saying, we can't buy inaccessible products now. Okay, so first things first, that's more stakeholders is one part of it. The tech sector understanding what it can do and being on the front foot on it, I think is the move first. So regardless of who you are, whether you're an independent software vendor, building the next new technology for manufacturing, whatever it might be, okay, is it accessible is going to be a question that you're going to be asked by your customer. And increasingly, you're going to be thinking about kind of, are we regulated in this space? So anyone in retail or travel and transport or banking in Europe right now, building any kind of technology is going to have to be accessible by European law. So that's coming. And it's impossible to conceive that it's only going to be specialist accessibility companies and tech companies that are going to deliver that demand. So we're going to get much more mainstream demand for this. There's the capability in some of the biggest SIs and the ISVs out there to do this, but there's going to be more demand coming. And so what I'm interested in is a lot of work with our partner network at Microsoft, particularly in industry, to start driving this awareness, building momentum around the topic, regardless of whether you're in the product space or the infrastructure space. I think that's going to be number one. And not least because I'm going to be pushing a lot of that. So, I'm definitely going to make that happen, right? And we just released some
Yeah.
videos showcasing, new accessibility companies, I might call them, like kind of, not niche or specialist, respectfully, right? As in, we're not saying it's not just a unique topic to them. They do many, many other things as an organization. But what we're asking them to do is list what you can also do on accessibility and be deliberate about it. So to me, that's one thing. And we can come back to and discuss that. But the second thing, of course, is Gen AI. I mean, when I joined Microsoft, the big moment was Azure or cloud and cloud accessibility and AI. What you might call first AI. Cognitive services. When we think about text to speech, speech to text, image recognition, we were starting to see those first tools come out, and that drove a ton of innovation. What you're going to start to see is Gen AI. I mean, like from an accessibility perspective, right now, I'm now able to, with tools that are out there, readily available out there now, to open up a complex chart and ask questions about that complex chart. And the content itself is wholly inaccessible. Like it's just literally an image, and yet,
Yeah.
now it's not legally accessible. That's not the point. But I can ask questions about that content, and so there's going to be a very interesting conversation to have with the accessibility industry as a whole about what's the mix of Gen AI tools and structural accessibility, and what will be the real lived experience of somebody. If you think from a screen reader user's perspective, do I actually want to tab through all the data points on that graph and listen to them, or do I just want to ask what the summary of that graph is? Yeah, is the question. That's the exam question. I think that's going to get really interesting the more that people with disabilities start to understand what these technologies can do. I actually booked this morning a session with one of my friends who's blind to do precisely that with Power BI. We're going to really go play with Gen AI and Power BI to understand like come on, like what would you ask it? What you like? We're looking at a sales chart. Give me the questions. Or we're looking at some election polls. Right? Give me the questions. And then let's start seeing what the AI can do. So I think that's going to be really interesting. And then, of course, if we're doing that to graphs, why are we not doing that to content? We're going to be able to start. AI is going to be able to kind of look at content and go, okay, I'm going to structure this for you. So from an engineering perspective, fixing. And I'm not here to say we're there yet, or I'm not here to make any product announcements or anything. But it's obvious that that's the way things are going to go. The more intelligent AI gets, the more AI is going to play a part in this industry as much as it's going to disrupt finance or as much as it's going to disrupt customer service. So, it's going to be a smart strategy to be closely connected to what's happening in Gen AI for anybody in this space.
You're a wealth of knowledge and share a lot of interesting insights. I mean, the one thing that I couldn't stop thinking about is, you had the rise of DXPs many years ago, right? And how did you
You're going to have
tailor
to help me with DXPs. I say I don't live in your world.
digital experience platforms, right? Where you're
Okay. Oh,
customizing
sorry. Right. Yeah.
interaction based on different personas. And what I'm hearing from you is like, well, in your Power BI demo, like, hey, how do we deliver the data summaries, if you will, and the data outputs? The input is there, right? You have text, you have speech to text or speech interaction with
Yep.
a set of graphs. How do I tailor this information back to the user? I mean, that's globally beneficial to anyone,
Of
right?
course.
Like,
This was the beauty of this conversation this morning. It's the guy that my friend is an analyst. He's a market analyst. He's blind. And
yeah,
he basically just says, I don't do visuals. He just says that to all of his customers. Like, don't send me visuals. They're pointless. But let's talk about the market trends and all this kind of stuff. Okay. Now he's going, I can do visuals. Let's go. Let's go. It's fundamentally going to change, his experience. But all of his experience of not being able to access visuals is going to drive the narrative of what the AI is going to want, because we're all going to be scrambling, going, "What would you even ask?" Right? Like, because I can see this thing, yeah. And from a current accessibility structural perspective, we think the answer is all the data points accessible and scannable and in an orderly manner. Like, really, that's not going to work. That's not a great experience. So I'm really excited.
information.
There's an analogy, just quickly. So let me give you this. This blew my mind on Copilot, and I just think, like, we're not going to invent everything that benefits. Some things are just going to literally fall out of the machine, aren't they? Right? Yeah. So Copilot, obviously, we have great transcript in Teams meetings. Okay, so like we've got good, accurate transcripts, and that transcript is actually driven by your own data, as in your company data is kind of driving the accuracy of that transcript, because that vocabulary sits in your SharePoints and stuff, right? And you're using Teams to get great transcribed meetings. Okay, but that's just a ton of data that I have to crawl through to get the information I want. And so I was speaking to an autistic colleague in a Teams meeting. What she now does is she says, what would be a smart question to ask Brian? And then the AI will go, well, he's just been talking about this, this, and this. Go and ask him this. So from a social perspective, she's saying, oh, I find social questioning really hard. That's my nervous point, where I'm just like, I'm not enjoying this. And she's leaning into the AI. Now, she could scroll all the way through the transcript, but the AI is like, that's not the experience. No one's going to do that. The experience is, okay, AI, what should I ask? I love
Keep the
these.
conversation.
These are really,
Yeah.
like, no one invented it, as I said, but that is like, what is the lived experience of people with disabilities and AI first systems going to be? That's pretty cool.
Well, my biggest takeaway, and I think we need to probably plan for part two, because there's
Anytime.
a lot to unpack here. But the aspect that you've said a few times now was be deliberate, right? And I think that's so fundamental and important to anything, but especially within the accessibility space. And the horizon aspect of driving the adoption was huge. So, Hector, I want to say a huge thank you to having the conversation today. Certainly, if there's anything you want to close out with, I'll leave the open mic to you. But otherwise, it was such an enjoyable, insightful conversation.
Well, I mean, firstly, thank you for inviting me. I mean, I love it, and thanks for continuing to educate me in the accessibility space. I mean, please, like keep it coming. But be deliberate, but be deliberately brave, and lift your horizons. I mean, the number of people I meet who are not brave enough to knock on the door of their CTO and go, hey, Microsoft are having this conversation. Like, why are we not having this conversation? So like, go and do that. And then we've got all the collateral that we're trying to share as much as we can on the strategic, on the deliverables, on the approach and everything. Share what we're, take what we're trying to share out there. Not just us. I mean, come on, others in the big tech world are being just as kind of, deliberate on this as well. So just go out with what's there. Use big tech as a lever to kind of lift the value of this conversation. But one thing I would always leave people with is, this ain't going away. The human relationship with technology, the relationship of diverse humans with technology is just going to be, that's the conversation of the next 50 years. More people are going to be using it. So like this is a great career. This is a great topic to be in. So stay engaged, but be deliberate, and just like get brave, knock on those doors.
Cool. Hector, thank you again. I really
Pleasure.
appreciate it.